All right, everybody. So what I wanted to focus my attention on today was chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with the topic of nations and society. And in reality, what we're really looking at is what are some different ways that we can divide groups within a state? Okay. And in this chapter that we're going to discover that there are several ways we can do it. We can divide groups within a state by their ethnic identity. We can divide groups within a state by their national identity, by their citizenship and patriotism, uh, by their political attitudes and political ideology, by their religion, and by the political culture. You're going to see political culture as a little bit of a mix of political attitudes, ideology, regime, and a few of the other terms we already discussed earlier in chapter 2. So the textbook defines society as a collection of people that are bound by shared institutions that define how human relations should be conducted. So what you're really looking at is society is a group of people that share institutions in common, and those institutions that they share define how people interact with one another. That's a very broad definition for society. Social identity related to social society is a sense of who a person is based off of where they stand in society. So social identity is how you identify yourself within your society. Okay. Now, two of the main ways that social identities are going to be defined are through ethnicity, or it's also known as ethnic identity, and national identity. Okay. So these social identities, which the PowerPoint makes a point of explaining, help to try to provide an answer to the question of who is each person, and it's one way that we understand how people organize themselves within society. Okay. So when you're looking at ethnic identity is the same thing as ethnicity. And the In Focus section of the textbook mentions that ethnic identity is a set of specific attributes, societal institutions that make one group of people culturally different from others. So you're looking at specific markers and institutions that differentiate from a cultural standpoint one group of people from another. Another thing we need to remember when it comes to ethnic identity is it's frequently going to be, those societal institutions or those markers that I mentioned are frequently going to be based off of customs or language or religion. It is ascriptive, which is a fancy word that simply means you are born with it. Ascriptive. So if something is ascriptive to you, you are born with it. It's not something that you can marry into. It's not something that you can change because you desire to fit into that specific ethnicity. No, ethnic identity is something that you were born into, and it's in your blood because of who your parents and ancestors were. Lastly, ethnic identity is not inherently political. Now, it could be political, but by definition, it doesn't have to be. It's not by necessity political. So you're going to discover that certain ethnic groups may end up holding certain political ideologies, but that's not of its own a reason why the ethnic group is an ethnic group. Okay. So, you know, it is true that ethnicity does have something to do with genealogy, but we're not necessarily looking at it from a biological standpoint. Okay. Remember that you're going to discover that the distinction between one ethnic group and another may be very minor, especially to outsiders. There are ethnic groups within Latin America that Hispanics may be able to differentiate, but if you're somebody who is not Hispanic, if you're an Anglo-American, you're going to struggle many times differentiating between the differences and the difference between the different ethnic groups. If you're somebody who is from Asia, frequently a way that many less educated people label all Asians by calling everybody Chinese. But to an Asian, that is extremely offensive because there are many different ethnic groups, even within Asia. Chinese is just simply one of them. And even then, the term Chinese is not an ethnicity in and of itself. There's Hans and other ethnic groups within China. And so ethnic groups are not necessarily easily distinguishable to outsiders, but within those ethnic groups themselves, they do understand their own differences. They do know their own differences. Okay. And it is true that borders between ethnic groups are frequently very hard to put a line on the sand and say, from this point to this point on a map is where this ethnic group belongs, and from this point to this point on another map is where another ethnic group belongs. And so ethnic groups may differentiate themselves based off of different means. If you're in the state of Bosnia, Croats, Serbs, and Muslims, their main differentiator between each of them is religion. Okay. So the main cultural difference that differentiates Bosnia's ethnicities is religion. Whereas if you were to go to Rwanda, okay, the Hutu and the Tutsi are two ethnic groups that are extremely similar to each other, and there are no real discernible biological, religious, or cultural practices that differentiate them. Okay, so those ethnicities, many scholars believe, are literally inventions of their colonial past, when perhaps the original classification was based off of a family member's wealth. In other words, that was defined as how much cattle a member had compared to another, and based off of that, they divided the Hutus and the Tutsis into different groups. Okay, and so then the textbook makes the question of the PowerPoint writers, which are made by the textbook, present the question of, is race and ethnicity in the United States? Okay. And so there are many different ways to answer that question. It's a bit tricky. Race is not even perhaps the only means of identifying somebody from an ethnic perspective, because even within people who would identify themselves as being Black, they come from, Black people come from different ethnic identities themselves. And so ethnic identity is perhaps in the United States even deeper than simply race, or, race may be more broad, perhaps, in the United States than ethnic identity. Now, another way that we can differentiate people within society is through their national identity. Okay. And how would we define a nation? Well, the In Focus section of the textbook defines national identity as a sense of belonging to a nation. And a nation is defined as a group of people that wants to be able to govern themselves through their own independent state. Okay. So national identity is tied into a group of people who belong to a nation, and they have a belief in their own political aspirations. Frequently, but not always, national identity stems from ethnic identity. So an ethnic identity, a group that's from a specific ethnicity, may have an aspiration to become a nation with their own identity, for which they'd be able to have their own state and govern themselves within that state. While ethnic identity is not inherently political, national identity, by definition, because they want to have their own state that they can govern themselves in, those individuals who have a national identity by nature their national identity is inherently political. Lastly, the basis for nationalism is national identity. And we can define nationalism as the pride that a group of people have in their own belief, in their own people, that they each share a unique political destiny. Okay. So that's the definition of a nation or of national identity. We can go into a little bit more terms. Again, we can define this in a different way. Like I said earlier, a nation is a group that desires self-government, frequently through an independent state. National identity is an institution that binds people together through common political aspirations. Okay, you can think of national identity as being the sense of belonging to a nation. So if you think you belong to a nation, you have a national identity. Um, and this is an institution that people have shared with one another, for which they aspire to have common political goals. Lastly, nationalism, like I said, is a pride in one's people and belief that they have a unique political destiny. Okay. So the question of whether who is a nation, okay, we it's hard to define whether Americans have a nation or not. I've gone, you can go back and forth in that argument. Certainly, the Native American tribes who came from before the United States, we might think of them in some ways as a nation, right? Like the Cherokee Nation. Of course, they would have had to have had an inherent political desire to govern themselves, and I believe they did. And I believe they did. In other countries, the United Kingdom, for example, the Scottish independence movement is a nationalist or a movement. Irish Republicans in Northern Ireland who want to break away from the United Kingdom are also a nation in their own way. Those people that do want to be part of that nation. In Spain, you have the Catalans in the north. And in Turkey, you have the Kurds who also aspire to have their own state through which they'd be able to manage their own desire for self-governance. Okay. Another way we can divide people within a society is through these concepts of citizenship and patriotism. So citizenship is really an individual's relationship to the state. You can think of it as a contract. The individual swears loyalty to the state in exchange for the state promising to give the citizen certain benefits or rights that that others do not have, that non-citizens do not have. Okay, I'll repeat that again. So, like I said, a citizenship is you're going to look at the relationship between the individual and the state. It's a contract where the state promises to give an individual certain benefits or rights in exchange for the individual to swear allegiance to the state. Now, by definition, citizenship is political. And as a result, you can change your citizenship status in a way that you really cannot do with ethnic identity or national identity. What is the basis for patriotism? The basis for patriotism is pride in one's state and in your citizenship. Now realize this is different than the basis for nationalism. Basis for nationalism is pride in one's belief in one's people and the belief that they have a unique political destiny. Patriotism is pride for the state and citizenship, which means you could be a patriot while belonging to a different ethnic identity than the majority of the people within your state. There could be multiple ethnic groups, all of whom have a sense of patriotism while also maintaining pride in their own ethnicity. And so citizenship is what grants these ethnic groups the feeling of belonging and the sense of pride for their state, the fact that they are citizens and that through their citizenship status, they have a contract with the state where the state gives them rights and benefits in exchange for the citizens' loyalty to the state. Right? And so we've already gone over these definitions. Now, keep in mind, the fact that you have citizenship does not of its own guarantee patriotism. You can be a citizen of a state and not be proud of your state. You can be a citizen of a state and in theory, betray your state, right? And not even be loyal to it. You could betray your state. You could be a traitor. So citizenship on its own is not enough to guarantee patriotism. However, being a citizen might, in a way, be a prerequisite, or it is a prerequisite to being a patriot. Okay. The key here, remember, is ethnicity is largely a social identity. Nationhood is a combination of a political and social identity, while citizenship is entirely a political identity. So citizenship is entirely a political identity. It's not an identity based off of birth. No, a person, depending on the state, may be born into one citizenship status and change their citizenship status by changing the loyalty of the state that they swear their allegiance to. Okay. And the textbook makes a point of differentiating between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism, again, pride in your people and desire for statehood. Patriotism, on the other hand, is pride in your state. Nationalism is the group may or may not have a state. They have a desire for statehood. They may or may not have that desire met. Patriotism, by necessity, if you're a patriot, you have your own state. Last but not least, in a nationalist, if you're in the nationalist movement, the group may not like the current state very much. Whereas historically, in patriotism, individuals who are patriots may have weaker attachments to ethnic or national identities. Okay. Now, frequently, there is some overlap between nationalism and patriotism. All right. It is possible, though, that an individual may have a strong sense of national identity, but not a high sense of patriotism. This would be, for example, a member of the Scottish, somebody who is a supporter of Scottish independence may have a strong sense of nationalism in Scotland, Scottish independence. They may be strongly in support of Scottish nationalism, while not having a sense of patriotism, because, of course, they're not proud of belonging to the state of the United Kingdom. On the flip side, it is possible that you can be a patriot while not having a strong sense of national identity. You may not have a sense of nationalism, but you may have a sense of patriotism. It's hard to explain, but you may not believe that you belong to an ethnic group or a nation itself, and rather you belong to the state and you're proud of your state. Okay. Now, identities really come from or emerge as a result of the creation of the modern state. So as the modern state is invented through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, there's increased commercialization and urbanization, meaning there's more cities and commerce within the state. There's more forms of social interactions within people of the state. There are more new institutions that tie people within the state to one another. And as a result, new identities form from this. State leaders realized that if they helped create an identity of nationhood or an identity of ethnicity or an identity of patriotism, it was a means of strengthening their grip and power within the state. And so as a result, this is how ethnic and national identities in some ways emerged, but it was not just the state that helped lead to the creation of national and ethnic identities, but rather also ethnic and national identities will lead to the transformation of this concept of state. And it's nowhere better seen than in the definition called the nation state. A nation state is a sovereign state where there is one dominant nation that the nation state claims to represent and embody. The original one was in France. Perhaps a more modern example of a nation state today, the textbook mentions, you're looking at Germany, Japan, and Yemen. Right? France, it's controversial as to whether they're a nation state today because there's a larger Muslim population or Arab population within their community, and France has tried to ban the wearing of headscarves and burqas in public spaces, which is a controversial topic within certain members of their large Arab community. All right. Now, some nations are divided, right? And they may still have a sense of patriotism. A South Korean may be proud of being a citizen of the state of South Korea, and theoretically, the same may be true of someone who lives in North Korea, even though at the end of the day, they're in reality both Koreans. Many states have multiple nations. Okay, the United Kingdom has multiple nations. Nigeria has multiple nations. And some nations lack states of their own. Palestinians do not really have an official state. The Kurds, who reside in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, they don't have their own state, and they are a nation that aspires to have one. Okay. In the caption, the book mentions how, or the PowerPoint authors mention how sometimes one nation dominates two states, but they may still be considered divided. This is an example of Korea with North and South. And in some instances, you're going to find multinational states or countries with more than one nation, right? The United Kingdom is an example because there are at least 3 separate nations that belong to Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, and England. And if you were to include it to the broader term of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, then you're also looking at Northern Ireland as perhaps being a separate nation that's united under that common state. In the developing world, there were state borders that were made by colonial powers, where states contain multiple nations. So in Nigeria, you have over 250 different ethnic groups. Okay. And of course, there are some instances where, like I said, some nations are just, they don't have a state. Okay. You might also see that in China with Tibet in the southern part of China. You might see that in some of the Native American tribes in Canada and in the United States, where they don't have their own states. Not all ethnicities are nations, because to be a nation, you must have your own desire to have a political future for your group, and not all ethnic groups have that, and not all nations are countries. Okay. Now, when we're looking at two concepts that we're going to explore further, ethnic conflict and national conflict, it's important that we understand what this means. Okay. A national conflict is a conflict between groups who seek or desire to stop another group from gaining sovereignty. An example of this were the period called the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which happened, I believe it started in the 60s and 70s, and it didn't really end, I want to say, until the 90s. I could be mistaken. The Troubles were a period where Northern Irish felt discriminated. Northern Ireland is on the island of Ireland. It belongs to the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland, because of its historical connections to the British, is Protestant, while Ireland is Catholic. Well, there were still Catholics within Northern Ireland, and the Troubles movement started when those that were Protestant and supported Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom, we call them the Loyalists, basically had an insurrection done against them by Catholic Northern Irish who were Republican and wanted their own states or wanted to join with Ireland. And these groups were fighting with one another. because these conflicts were between groups were fighting for sovereignty within the same state, it was called a national conflict. Okay. It's important to remember that while some of these conflicts throughout the world may be centuries old, there's nothing stopping them from potentially achieving peace. For example, there were tensions, national conflict tensions between Protestant and Catholic communities for a very long time, but the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in Good Friday, between the Northern Irish IRA, which is the ethnic group, the group that wanted to break away from the UK, and the British loyalists, the Protestant loyalists, they reached peace. And as a result, since then, there's been a lot of peace in Northern Ireland. Okay. But even after they de-escalate and there's peace made, sometimes these tensions may continue. And you'll discover that even though the Good Friday Agreement was very successful, once the British broke away from the European Union, people in Northern Ireland who supported remaining in the European Union felt left behind, along with Scottish people in the United Kingdom. And in some instances, this Brexit, the British exit from the European Union, has led people to fear that perhaps the conflict between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland may once again reemerge. Ethnic conflict, on the other hand, is conflict between ethnic groups. And they're struggling to achieve certain political or economic goals at each other's expense. So ethnic conflict is two ethnic groups. They're each trying to get something at the other's expense. National conflict is one nation wants to break away from another nation or from another group, and perhaps the other group is trying to keep them in the state. So national conflict deals with sovereignty and whether a nation should be allowed to become its own state or join with another state. Whereas ethnic conflict is conflict between ethnic groups within a state, or maybe even potentially multiple states, that are trying to achieve certain political domination or economic domination at the expense of the other ethnic group. And so we try to figure out the question as to why it is that ethnic and national conflict exists. There's different explanations for it. The textbook hones in on three. Perhaps the fact that these groups are inherently different is what leads to ethnic and national conflict, right? The fact that there's differences between groups from a societal standpoint. Another explanation for why ethnic or and national conflict may exist revolves around economic inequalities. And so there might be a fight for economic resources or income. And these disparities between resources and certain groups or income in certain groups may lead to ethnic and national conflict. Last but not least, there are also political explanations that perhaps ethnic groups are ostracized or being held back by the state, or perhaps the state is not providing them it's not using its capacity to care for ethnic groups within their state, or perhaps the state does not have the autonomy, and the nation or the ethnic group wants its own autonomy so that they can provide for themselves, or perhaps it might be a conflict with the politics of the state itself, and an ethnic group or a national group disagrees with how politics is being conducted at the state level. These explanations provide perhaps a means of looking into why it is that ethnic and national conflict exists. And in the case of Nigeria, we're going to discover that Nigeria has political divisions. So political reasons are partially why there's ethnic and national conflict in Nigeria. There's going to be economic issues, specifically over income inequality and the sharing of oil revenue between the different ethnic groups. So economic reasons are also why there is conflict in Nigeria. And lastly, there's also societal divisions where the different groups each have their own value systems. And that's another explanation for why it is that Nigeria has ethnic and possibly national conflict. Okay. Now, this is a very important part of the lesson, political attitudes and ideology. Okay. We need to explain what political attitudes are. Political attitudes deal with the speed and the way that change should take place, political change should take place in a state. And so political attitudes are going to all be about change, the rate of change, and the manner in which you want change. But of course, because political attitudes are about change within your state, you first have to analyze where, from a regime standpoint, your state is. Because if your state is, the change is going to be from where your state currently is. And as a result, the terms that we use are going to vary depending on the position, the starting point of your particular state. We call this particularistic, meaning that political attitudes are going to be relative to the specific context of a given country. A person who's a radical in one country because they want communism, right, as the political ideology, might be a conservative in another because they want to not change from the governing system in that country, which is perhaps in another country communism. So, for example, in Cuba, if you believe in supporting the status quo of communism, you're going to be considered a conservative. Whereas maybe in the United States, if you want to revolutionize the existing political regime of the United States immediately, because you don't believe that the democratic regime is worth anything, then you might be considered a radical if you want to go to communism. And so political attitudes are going to be based first off of understanding what the starting point is for the specific state that we're analyzing. It's important to understand that political attitudes are different from political ideologies. And generally, we can divide political attitudes into 4 categories. Number 1, radical. Number 2, liberal. Number 3, conservative. And number 4, reactionary. Okay. So radicals are people who want large-scale institutional change immediately. They don't believe in the current regime. They want to eliminate the regime and have massive wholesale institutional change immediately. Liberals are okay with the existing institutions. They want to change them, but they want those changes done within the confines of the existing regime. Conservatives are skeptical of change, and as a result, they just want to maintain the status quo. They like the existing regime. They're not necessarily very big fans of change. They want things to remain as they are. While radicals seek to restore political, social, and economic institutions to a past, whether that past did exist or it was imagined. Okay. Remember, political attitudes are going to be addressing the issues of the pace and the scope of change in our efforts to understand the balance between freedom and equality. So if you're on the far left, when it comes to political attitude, you're going to be considered a radical. You're going to be very dramatic, perhaps in support of revolutionary change to the existing political, social, economic behavior or order. If you're a radical, you believe that old institutions are broken and must be replaced. So, for example, in the Middle East, there was a movement called the Arab Spring that started with Tunisia when a merchant burned himself alive in protest over the lack of democracy in Tunisia. And as a result, people took to the streets. And they were radicals. Why? Because in Tunisia, they wanted to get rid of their dictator. And they wanted to get rid of the regime that allowed for dictatorships. And they were radicals who wanted a democracy. By the same token, in a democracy, if you're a radical, you want to eliminate democracy and go to a different regime. So radicalism is not necessarily a bad term, depending on your perspective. It's all a matter of what that radical is trying to radically change to. On the other hand, a liberal, when we're talking about liberalism from the political attitude perspective, they support gradual, slow change. They believe that existing institutions can make a positive change. Okay. And so that's the term that we would use for political attitudes. The textbook mentions US Democrats who theoretically don't want to change the existing regime, but they want to have the government take more and more of your income as a means of redistributing it to provide for what they perceive as income inequalities between the rich and the poor, while doing so within the confines of the democratic regime of the United States. Political attitudes on the right start with conservatives, okay? So conservatives are in the middle right of that line. They're going to be skeptical of change. They're going to support the continuity of the institutions. They don't really want change. They like the traditions that have been around. And they're afraid that change will have unintended effects. Okay. An example of a conservative would be, in today's day and age, perhaps a supporter of, in Cuba, of the communist regime, because they are supporting the existing regime and they don't want to change it. They want to continue working within it. They value the Communist Party and the perks that they may feel have been given to them because of their involvement with the Communist Party. And as a result, they may be a conservative communist. And that's why these terms do not apply to political ideology, but rather to political attitudes. Reactionaries are to the far right in terms of political attitude, and they, like radicals, dislike strongly the current order. But unlike radicals who want to change to something that's never been seen before, reactionaries seek to go back to a older system, whether it was true or not. And an example of this is the phrasing of "Make America Great Again," right? In many ways, Donald Trump was a reactionary who wanted to go back to a time where he believed America was great again, compared to the lack of greatness that he perceived to be in America at the time that he ran for president. Another way of looking at this is that radicals are extreme liberals and reactionaries are extreme conservatives. Okay. Please understand that the meaning of the words conservative and liberal sometimes are used to define political ideologies. But when we're talking about conservative and liberal, when we're talking about the word conservative, we're going to be talking about the political attitude. When we're talking about liberal, it can be political ideology or a political attitude, and those words have very different meanings. Since I've mentioned political ideologies, let's get right to them. Political ideologies are sets of political values regarding the fundamental goals of politics. So these values are going to be one group's answer to handle the question that is in many people's minds. How do we handle this tension between equality and freedom? Now, unlike political attitudes, which are particularistic, political ideologies are not specific to one country or era. They're universal, meaning we can use the same political ideology, the same term of fascism may be applied to a political movement group in Italy as it may mean in Germany, as it may be in Spain. And political ideologies are going to be distinct from political attitudes. They're not the same. I mentioned that several times already. Now, when you're looking at political ideologies, these are the basic values that an individual holds regarding the fundamental goals of politics. Or another way of looking at it, an individual's way of trying to provide a balance between freedom and equality, whatever they feel that ideal balance looks like, that's going to be their political ideology. And there are five main political ideologies in modern day world. Liberalism. Liberalism is going to emphasize individual freedom. Okay, they're going to believe that the government should exist, but it should be very limited in its power, because whenever the state exercises its monopoly of power, if they abuse it, or if they get too involved in it, they're abusing it. And their preference is to provide individuals with a maximum amount of freedom, even if in doing so, inequality grows. The extreme opposite of that is communism. Communism maximizes in its belief system equality. They want everybody to be economically equal, even if it comes at the expense of individual freedom. They don't care about individual freedom. They believe that individual freedom is what has caused income inequality, and their goal is to solve income inequality, even if it comes at the expense of individual freedom. Socialism, or social democracy, they mean the same, is essentially a middle point between liberalism and communism, where they try to provide what they believe is a balance between freedom and equality. A liberal is going to support things like private property, free markets, businesses being able to operate with very limited interference from the state. A socialist is going to support the notion that people should be allowed to own their own private property, but they're going to want to have the government heavily involved in how businesses interact with individuals and how much money a person should be allowed to have, because they believe that the rich should be incredibly taxed, so that with the excess income that they tax, they can provide for a more equal society that allows people to have enjoy benefits more fairly, as they see it. Fascism is all about promoting the state. They promote the state at the expense of the individual. The state, of course, they believe that the state should be the instrument that a superior race or group uses, and their belief is that the goal of the state is to promote the emergence of a superior genetic race or a superior group. But the individual comes second to that, and the questions regarding freedom and equality come second to the state. They don't care about freedom or equality. Their goal is to maximize the power of the state for the benefit of a specific racial or perhaps ethnic group or nationalist group. Last but not least, anarchism. They believe that any form of government is corrupt. They want to eliminate government altogether. They want to, they don't care about the question of economy or equality or freedom. If anything, they care about the extreme version of as much freedom as humanly possible. And they believe that the government is what creates inequality economically and what creates a lack of freedom. They believe the state needs to be eliminated. Okay. Now, according to an anarchist, they believe that there's going to be a high degree of equality if there's by eliminating the state, and there will be a high degree of freedom. They value both tremendously, and they think the way to accomplish that is through the elimination of the state. If you are a socialist, you believe that you need to be smack in the middle between equality and freedom, which is this midpoint right here. If you're a communist, you believe that you can maximize equality, but it's going to come at the expense of having freedom. You're going to have very little freedom. If you're a fascist, you don't care about freedom or equality. And if you're a liberal, you care a lot about freedom, but you aren't necessarily you don't care as much about equality. Okay. Again, liberalism, let people pursue their own interests. Let's limit the role of the state when it comes to making political decisions, societal decisions, economic decisions. And the regime that is invented because of liberalism is called the liberal democracy. A liberal democracy is a system of political, social, and economic liberties supported by competition, participation, and contestation. The United Kingdom is an example of a liberal democracy. The United States is an example of a liberal democracy. Okay. This is some of the different meanings of the word liberal. For our class right now, we really care about it in the sense of a political attitude and a political ideology. Okay. But we may also use it sometimes in the sense of political economy. If you really realize it, these three are very similar, whereas this is a little bit different. Okay. Communism is going to reject notions of freedom. They don't believe freedom is going to provide prosperity for a majority. And the role of the state is to make sure that wealth is redistributed equally. They don't believe in private property. Their famous quote is, from each person, if you think about it, from each according to his ability, meaning we get from each as much as they can give us, to each person according to their needs. And communism, as a regime, the communist regimes have been found in the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. Social democracy is a mixture between communism and liberalism. You're going to try to find a middle ground between freedom and equality. You want strong markets and you want a role for private ownership. You also want a strong state to regulate industry and engage in social spending. So if you're a socialist, you're going to support a large number of welfare benefits. Welfare benefits are expenditures made by the state to provide people with benefits in the areas of social security, healthcare, so on and so forth. Okay. An example of socialist states, you're looking at Germany and Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Fascism, they don't care about freedom and equality. They believe in strict social hierarchies. They believe that certain racial groups are above others, and as a result, they believe inherently in inequalities. Literally, these are racists, or they discriminate based off of ethnicity. An example of this would look like fascist Nazi Germany. Anarchy, there's no state today that's an anarchy. It's an anarchy because if there was by definition, if there was a state that had anarchy as its political ideology, the state would not exist. But if you look at that Western Morocco region, I would probably tell you that's an area where there's anarchy. Anarchism believes that the state is a threat to freedom and equality. And so they want to eliminate the state and eliminate the concept of private property because that would maximize freedom and equality. People would be able to take and give and do whatever they want without any restrictions. This helps understand how ideology and political attitudes may connect in the United States. So if you have the liberalist ideology in the United States, meaning you want a limited role in society for the state, and you want a limited role in society for the state to control, and it's not just in society, but also in economic activity. You want to maximize freedom personally or over social equality. You are a conservative in the United States. Okay. If you are a communist, you're going to be a radical in the United States because you're trying to get rid of the liberal ideology that is historically present in the United States. You're going to emphasize, again, you're going to limit personal freedom because you want a very strong state to tell people what to do so that you can achieve social equality. The property should be owned by the state, and market forces, businesses, let's eliminate them. Everything should be owned by the state. Socialism supports private property and markets, but believes that the state has a strong role to play in regulating the economy and providing benefits to the public. They want to find a middle ground between freedom and equality. This is what a liberal, from a political attitude perspective, in North America would look like. A fascist, they want to achieve a very powerful state. And so if you're a fascist in the United States, you're a reactionary because you want to go back to an era where you felt the United States was very powerful as a state. Last but not least, an anarchist is somebody who's wanting to eliminate private property and the state because you believe that by doing so, you will achieve freedom and equality for everybody. And they also believe that a high degree of freedom and a high degree of social equality is possible once you eliminate property and state. This would be a radical position. So you can see that communism and anarchism in the United States would both be radical positions, whereas fascism would be a reactionary position, socialism would be a liberal position, and liberalism would be a conservative position. The last way, there's two more ways you can divide people or describe people or people within a society. Religion, okay? So in some instances, many of these ideologies, they're considered secular, meaning that they're not, none of those ideologies are connected to religion. They're an alternative to religion. In some places, you're starting to see a rejection of secularism because sometimes secularism meaning that religion should be a private matter, not something present within the state. In some instances, people believe that the lack of religious moral leadership or religious values is weakening the state. Okay. So in these states where they want to reject secularism, secularism was weakly institutionalized to begin with. Now, if you want to make faith the sovereign authority, meaning you want to make God the most powerful authority and those who understand God, the most powerful rulers within your state, you're going to be a supporter of fundamentalists. If you want people that their most important values are based off of their religious beliefs, you're a fundamentalist. And this is a belief system. Fundamentalism is a belief system that tries to unite the religion and the state. They want to create a theocracy, a government by religious leaders. And their belief system is a fundamentalist believes that society is suffering from a spiritual disease. That's what malaise means. And that the cure is by bringing God to the people. Now, fundamentalism can be radical. Okay, it's radical if there has never been an emergence of religion where religious leadership is strongly present within your state. It can be reactionary if in your state's history there was a past where religious values were held supreme over other values. Or it can be a weird mix of both, where you want to do something that hasn't been done before, but also at the same time trying to imitate some of the religious values from the past. And fundamentalism can come from any religious from any religion. It doesn't have to be Christian. It can be Christian. It can be Muslim. It can be Buddhist. It can be Jewish. It can be anything. Okay. You'll discover that there are certain fundamentalist groups. Not all of them are the same. Not all of them espouse or support violence. Some of them do. Boko Haram in Nigeria is a Muslim fundamentalist group that wants to make Sharia law, Islamic law, the law of all of Nigeria. And they believe that allowing girls in Nigeria to attend school goes against the laws of Allah. And as a result, they want to institute fundamentalism where the values of their religious affiliation are supreme over any political ideology. You see it in certain Christian groups where they want to make the law of their understanding of the teachings of Jesus Christ to be supreme over any political ideology within the United States. Last but not least, political culture. Okay. Culture is the basic institutions that define a society. It's a roadmap to organize people's lives. Political culture is the basic norms of political activity in a society. So it's a roadmap to organize political and public life. So culture is about personal and social lives. Political culture is about public and political lives. The political culture of a specific state will help determine which ideologies dominate a country's political regime. They're going to be unique to each country or national group or ethnic group. They're also going to be distinct from political attitudes and political ideologies. Okay. I really don't care about this. And I do recommend that, even though I'm not going to go over them, I recommend that you guys look at the summaries. Some of these summaries help you guys understand these concepts a little bit better. Okay. But with that, I am done. Stay safe, everybody, and see you next time.